Hey guys, welcome back to the last video of this quilting series. If you are just finding this now, I will link video number 1 up here if you want to follow through all of the different steps that I filmed showing how I create a quilt. The usual disclaimer applies. I'm not a professional. I haven't learned from a professional. I'm self-taught. I've learned from bits and pieces on the internet, and this is just how I quilt. But I've created numerous quilts and it works for me. In today's video, we're going to talk about binding your quilt. So we've got to the stage where you have your 3 layers designed, pieced together, quilted together, trimmed and ready to be finished off. And to finish it off, you want to put a binding around the edge, and that is basically this. You can buy pre-made binding or you can just cut your own. I prefer to just cut my own because then I can choose the exact color and design of the fabric and it's just easier. Now your binding can just be all one color, or you can do a pieced in design, which this one has. So I've got a little bit of blue there, and on the other side I have a little bit of yellow. You can do different fabrics as you go along. Now usually when you put strips of fabric together to make your binding, you're going to piece them together like this. Can you see that little diagonal line where it meets over here? That is how you'll join your strips of fabric together. But for this pieced in design, I have straight seams. I wanted them to look straight. This is going to create a lot of bulk. I mean, it's not bad, but just bear that in mind if you do choose to do pieced in binding designs. You're going to have a bulky spot there if you have straight seams. There are online calculators that will tell you how much fabric you need to create a binding strip to go all the way around your quilt. I tend to kind of wing it because maths, you know, it's not my favorite thing. I know there are calculators which work it out for you. They can give you a rough guide, but mostly I just tend to wing it and cut and sew strips together until they look right. As for choosing the color for your binding, it's totally up to you. I picked the red out of this design for the binding. I like to choose a darker color, not only to kind of really edge it and finish it off, but because the edges of your quilt are going to get more wear and tear and I don't want them to get grubby. So for that quilt I chose red. The quilt behind me has a blue binding. Let me just grab a piece. There you go, it's got a blue binding. This baby quilt, I picked out a dark kind of pinkish color, which related to the colors in the quilt but also to the flowers in the backing. It's like a terracotta pinkish color. For this quilt I wanted a gray and I didn't have enough of this gray fabric, so I actually used a black duvet cover that I got from the thrift store and I turned it inside out, so it kind of has more of a textured gray look, but the front of it was actually black. So that's what I used for that binding, and I have another one here that's also just blue. So I picked out the blue in the quilt and also in the backing. The color that you choose for your binding is totally up to you, but a tip that I would share, like I said, is to use a darker color rather than a lighter one, just for wear and tear purposes. Speaking of wear and tear, you want your binding strip to be double layer. Because your edges are going to have more wear and tear, you want it to be nice and sturdy. I will show you how to prepare your binding in a minute, but I just wanted to talk about labels. You could just bind your quilt and be done, and quite often I do that, but sometimes I will add a label in. You can do any kind of embroidered design and piece it in. There's an example of one. I just embroidered my name, where I was when I created the quilt, and the year. And then I fastened that to the back before I bound the quilt. You could also just stitch a label on afterwards, or you can embroider directly onto the back of your quilt before you baste and quilt your quilt. But it's optional, you don't have to put a label on your quilt. Okay, that's enough talking. I'm now going to show you how to create your binding strips and then how to fasten them onto your quilt to finish it all off. To bind my quilt, I'm using this green fabric and I've cut some long strips that are 2.5 inches wide, and now I need to join them up together. I've just cut mine straight. I haven't done bias cut binding. If you want to know how to do that, there are plenty of YouTube tutorials showing you how to do that. It does behave better, it is more forgiving, and if you have any kind of curves on your quilt, if you have like rounded corners or scallops, you definitely want to do bias cut binding. But I've just got a small quilt and it's just straight, so I'm just doing straight cut strips. To join them together, This is going to be right side up. Obviously this doesn't have a right and wrong side, but if you're using a patterned fabric, you'll lay this one with a pattern on this side, and then you'll take this one with a pattern on the bottom, so right sides together, and place them like that, and then stitch from that corner to that corner, so from the outer corner to the outer corner. I have by mistake in the past done from the inner corner to the outer corner, and it's not going to work. So pop a pin in there if you need to, and then just stitch from corner to corner. Okay, I've got those two stitched together. I'm going to snip off the excess. Just pull this. And then flatten it out and give it a little press. And there you go, I have one long strip, which I'm now going to place face down, so right side down, and then fold it over so that the two edges meet, and iron it the whole way. Now you can see why it's important to have an angled seam. So the seam goes up and down there to join, because what's happening is at this place where it's folded, this is 3 times the thickness of fabric. So if you had a straight seam there, you'd have 3 times the thickness of fabric. Also on the back is 3 times the thickness of the fabric, and then you're going to stitch it to your quilt and then fold it over, so that's going to double it again. So you can have a really thick patch. Whereas if you do an angled seam, that thickness where the fabric is kind of 3 times the thickness because of this extra double layer is spread out over an area, and it's not all in one spot. The next step, once I've prepared my binding, is to do a dry fit. So I'm going to just kind of lay it out around the quilt to see how it fits. I won't start on a corner, I'll start in the middle, which I'll show you why when I come to finish the binding. I'm just going to lay it out as if I'm attaching it. Okay, the reason I did that before I just began attaching it was I wanted to see where that join fell. I don't want that on a corner because it will make it very difficult to make a neat mitered corner. But it's falling about there, so that's fine. It's far enough away from the corner, so now I can begin attaching my binding. I'm going to leave a few inches loose, and I'm going to start sewing it with all of the raw edges together. I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way around. I've still got my walking foot on from when I quilted, but that's fine, that's good. We're working with thick layers, so it actually is quite suitable. So like I said, I'm leaving maybe about 5 inches loose, popping the rest in, and I'm just going to start sewing around the edge with a 1/4 inch seam, which is the width of my foot from the center where the needle is to the edge. You can pin your binding before sewing if you want to, but I'm just going to kind of hold the edges together. I didn't want to faff around with pins. I'm coming up to the corner, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop a 1/4 inch before I get to the end here, and I'm going to backstitch and finish off my seam, leaving a 1/4 inch space there. Okay, I'm going to show you how to turn your corners. So if this is your vertical, you're going to fold this so that it's horizontal, like that. And then you've got a 90-degree angle there, and you've got a 45-degree angle there. Pinch the corner, oops, here, and fold it back again. So you've got your raw edges lined up there, and you've got a square at the top there. So turn your quilt and start sewing down here, and you can just sew right from the edge all the way down. And then just continue sewing exactly the same. You can see that this is starting to kind of ruffle up a little bit. It's not laying completely flat. That won't happen if you use a bias cut binding strip, but I'm just going to kind of stretch mine out and make sure it behaves as I go. I'll show you the corner from a different angle. Stopping ahead of time. Turn it around, fold that up so that makes a continuous line. And then pull it straight down like that. Okay, to finish up the binding, I have these two ends left. Normally I leave a bigger gap, but I kind of wasn't really paying attention. I've put a pin in there, and my binding started out as 2.5 inches, and then I folded it and ironed it, which made it 1.25 inch. So I'm going to lay my binding over there, and then from the pin I'm going to measure 1.25 inches that way and cut it. Well, first I'm going to mark it. So there's my 1 inch, there's the 1/4 inch mark. Mark there, and then I can cut that on the mark. And then I'll do the same for the other one. Lay it across, smooth it down, and then 1.25 inches from the pin, make a mark. And then I can cut that. So all that remains is to join these two together. Okay, I went and made my space bigger. I just couldn't work with that little gap, so I've backstitched there and unpicked some just to open it up a bit. So lift up your strips, open them up so they're like that, and then match the right sides together at an angle like you did when you first joined your binding. So like that. So you've got your right side there, you've got your right side going under there, they are together, and then you're going to stitch again from the outer corner to the outer corner. So I'm just going to pin that for myself just to make it a little bit easier. Pinning in the direction I'll be sewing, so I'll pop it into the sewing machine like that, therefore I want to pull the pin out this way. And I'm also going to pin this corner just so it doesn't shift around. And I'm going to go and do my seam from there to there. Okay, I've sewn that, so that's how it's looking at an angle. Now before I go and cut that, I just want to check. So yeah, that seems to be right. So I'm going to go and cut that just with a 1/4 inch allowance like before. And then you can just press it open with an iron or just with your fingers. And then finish sewing that closed. Take the pin out so don't hit it with a needle. But yeah, There you go. Finish sewing that, and then your binding is half on. Okay, you have your binding all stitched onto your quilt, and this is how it looks from the front, and from the back it looks like that. So turning it to the front, you're going to flip that up and then turn it over so it looks like that, and then you want to flip that over so that it binds that raw edge and also covers this row of stitching. And then I like to hand stitch it down. If you machine stitch that, your stitches are obviously going to show on the other side, and they're not necessarily going to line up perfectly with the binding all the way. If you did want to machine stitch it, I wouldn't stitch your binding to the front like that. I would sew it to the back, and then when you flip it over, this would be the front. You can just do one row of stitches and just make the thread the same color as your backing, and then any extra stitches wouldn't show. But I don't like to do that. I prefer to blind stitch it. So I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to fasten it with some little binder clips. Okay, I have my little clips now. I didn't have them to hand. So I'm going to fold it to make sure it's nice and tight over the end and clip it. I just use these. They're from the dollar store. You can get special quilting clips, but these are inexpensive and they do the job. Just make sure they're not rusty at all, or they'll leave marks on your quilt. Okay, now to sew it, see if I can show you from this angle. I use a needle and thread. You can make your thread the same color as your binding, the same color as your backing, or just a neutral color. Ideally you don't want it to show, so it shouldn't matter. So I've got my needle and thread. I'm going to go in the binding and out again, or like in the back there and out the crease, just to start it off. So there's a knot there. Just zoom in a little bit. Okay, so I've got this nice and pulled tight, holding that down. I'm going to take a tiny bit of the backing, like go in there, not all the way through, just in along the fabric, and then pop out the top and into the binding. So I've popped out the back there, and I've gone into the binding, and I'll go along inside the binding, pop out the binding, go into the backing, and continue like that. So you can kind of see how the thread will go. I think this is called a ladder stitch. So when it's pulled tight, that's what you'll see. You're not going to see any stitches, it's invisible. So back in the binding, oops, a little way into the backing, a little way into the binding, and just hand stitch. So I'm going to go and put on some YouTube videos and just sit and stitch while I listen or watch. There you go. That's how it's going to be when it's finished, but I need to go all the way around. Okay, I've stitched all along there and I've come to the corner, so I wanted to show you how I'm going to deal with the corner. So I'm just going to kind of press it flat, oops, move this out the way, and then try and make a 45-degree angle there, pinch it and fold it over. So I'm going to get kind of a mitered corner. Where's my needle gone? And my thread's there at the moment. I'm just going to do a little catch stitch there. Oops. This is why I like to make the thread the color of the binding, just in case that shows. And then I'm just going to continue in the same way. Oops. Doing my little ladder stitch. So hard to do with the camera between me and the stitching. There you go. So that is how my corner is going to look. There you go, my finished quilt for baby Joseph. That's how the binding looks at the front, and that's how it looks on the back. And that is your quilt finished. I would love to know if you've been quilting along with me through this series. Let me know what you've been creating, and if you could link me to some pictures, I would absolutely love that. I hope you've enjoyed the series. I hope you found it helpful. If you haven't started your own quilt yet, I would urge you to just dive right in. Give it a try and you might find a new hobby that you absolutely love. And the thing I enjoy about this hobby is not just the creative process, but then you have something useful that your family can enjoy afterwards for many years as well. If you haven't been watching this series from the beginning, I will link the playlist here so you can go back and watch from the beginning and see step by step how I create a quilt. I'll just finish my video with a little slideshow of some pictures of quilts that I've created in the past. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.